Hello there, and you're very welcome to this week's episode of Mullooly Matters, the latest in our series on the European housing crisis, brought to you in association with Renew Europe. I'm your host, Eoghan McArdle, and in this series, I'm bringing you insights from conversations I recently had at the Multidisciplinary Housing Action Exchange, organised by Ciaran Mullooly MEP and Renew Europe in Galway, which brought together public and private practitioners, industry professionals and community voices for a frank solution-based conversation about what must be done to tackle Ireland's current housing crisis. In this special episode, I was privileged to be joined by John O'Connor, who most recently served as chair of the Irish Government's Housing Commission, which last year published its report, aiming to develop a long-term policy for a sustainable and affordable housing system in Ireland. Widely regarded as one of the leading voices on housing and construction in Ireland, John brings decades of experience across the full housing landscape, working at the intersection of public policy, local government, the private sector and the non-for-profit organisations. He previously served as CEO of the Housing Agency, and before that, led major housing initiatives as Chief Executive of the Affordable Housing Partnership and as Executive Manager for Housing and Communities at Dublin City Council. Today, he continues this work as a member of the Programme Board for International Protection. In this wide-ranging interview, John discusses the focus and aims of the Commission in improving Ireland's housing system, given its growing demands, whether emergency action is needed to deal with the housing deficit, the importance of fully involving and engaging the public in housing decisions, rather than simply consulting them, and the importance of prioritising child homelessness when it comes to the long issues that the Housing Commission investigated. I began by asking John about his background in housing, which led to the government appointing him as chair of the Housing Commission.
Since the start of my career 40 years ago, I've either been involved in construction or housing. But the kind of latter part of my career, over the last 25 years, I was the head of housing and communities in Dublin City Council. I was chief executive of what was called the Affordable Homes Partnership. And more recently, I was chief executive of the Housing Agency. So big background, in housing over those years. So based on that, I was appointed by the government to chair a housing commission. The housing commission was focused on looking at how do we provide and deliver homes for people. So our main focus was on people and families and providing them with, a decent home. And we looked at the overall housing system from, what type of housing we needed, how do we achieve affordable and decent homes, whether people are buying or renting their home, and for the different life stages as well. Very importantly, we'd say you can't pick out a single item, in the housing mission. It's not a menu, it's a recipe. Everything has to work together to make a sustainable housing system. One thing I was speaking at an event, today in Galway is about on the housing delivery side, and to distinguish between that we have a housing deficit at the moment. So there's a lot of people that haven't got access to renting or buying a home, and some significant groups in that, often those in their 20s or 30s who want to form a household, want to have their own clear identity, and they're not able to access housing. So we need to deal with that housing deficit. Call it a backlog, houses that we need now, and people need them now. They don't need them it's not 10 years time. It's too late. So distinguish between that deficit of housing that we need to deal with, and then the ongoing supply of housing to meet, the growing demands, where we have there's two really big factors. There's increasing population, and that population will be a linear increase for many years, and household size is reducing. So for those two factors, we need a base of increasing delivery year on year. And then I say we specifically recommend emergency action to deal with the housing deficit. So we need to use vacant buildings, bring them back into use, but we need to also maybe significant areas for delivering of housing on a large scale, and taking other initiatives to build housing, particularly where there is existing infrastructure.
So you mentioned there about the state of housing at the moment. So you did mention there the deficit and the demand. What was the main recommendations of the Housing Commission in the state of things are now going into the future? What are the immediate actions that need to be taken?
Yeah. the immediate action, say, is addressing the housing deficit, and the first thing actually is to actually acknowledge it. Acknowledge
Yes.
that there's a housing deficit is the first thing. We made a certain other kind of key rec, you know recommendations right across. One is we have to focus on people and homes and communities and having an inclusive, society. The very first line in the Housing Commission's report. We could have all the fluff in terms of acknowledgements or anything at the start. We just got straight into it. Is housing needs to be recognised as a priority, and it needs to be absolutely recognised as a priority because people need homes.
Hmm.
And that was the first thing. And recognising that, we undertook two public consultations, and from those two, there were over 2,500 submissions from individuals and families around the country.
So you can see that it
Uh,
is a real
and it's a
area of
real
interest.
issue. And actually, um, the the submissions, um, will say very clearly, people in their submissions, in the main, they wrote on here is their situation and described in a very objective way their own situation and their own struggles in terms of getting a home. They want to have a family. They real difficulties renting a home or buying a home, but it's described it as what people want, you know, is forgetting about everything that's been said. They want just a home to live in, take part in society. The recommendations on the commission is one we addressed. We just need to recognise the importance of a home. It's kind of the core of society. People having homes and being part of the community. On affordability, is that it depends. People have different levels of income and different levels of assets. So we did say there needs to be a significant increase in the amount of social housing, affordable rental housing, assisting, a proportion of society. But we also need to ensure right across, from low to middle, income in particular, that needed to provide support for people to provide homes. We also said housing the state and government need to focus on actually investing in housing and taking that approach, so that they're assisting people today, accessing a home and having a home that is affordable,
Hmm.
based on their income. But also, we need to think about future our children, our future generations. So we need to have that assist people today, and then funds come back and then are used for future generations. So we need to think as much about our current generation as future generations. Going back to the housing deficit, there's significant number of people I say in their 20s, 30s, 40s who are nearly the lost generation in terms of housing. So actually, we did specific surveys of those groups in terms of what their situation is. In addition to other general surveys,
Yes.
we focus in on those groups. Again, it really pointed out their struggles, and the cost of housing, it just makes it, extremely difficult, if not impossible, for a lot of people and families. And we heard today, we talk about rents. One thing that struck me, that Ciaran Mullooly said today, we were talking about rents being 1,200 a month, or in some cases,
Yeah.
in Galway for a two-bedroom, it's 2,500 a month.
Yeah.
But actually, if you put that into an annual figure, you're talking about 30,000.
Yeah.
A family having to pay out 30,000 per year, for a home, that they're renting, and when you put it in that annual, this is the first time actually I heard it being expressed as an annual, as opposed to we all talking about it on a monthly rent.
True.
It
Yeah,
was,
you don't realize how much money it is at the end of the year that you
yes,
put towards your rent.
yeah, and it's on,
Yeah.
the other thing on one issue that we grappled with with the housing commission was that in some cases we said don't bring in other policy. You have
Hmm.
a system for social housing, you have a system for cost rental housing, for affordable housing. Stick with what you have. make them improve the systems and make them work better. But it's important to keep consistent. See, in terms of how things are done was very, very important. The other one on affordability, there's a dangerous narrative getting in on the affordability side. It said that somebody that 30% of their income, you shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income on your housing needs. But the view from the Commission is, yes, that is fine day one, when you're actually buying a home or renting a home for the first time. But over time, you need the affordability to be reducing. It's like somebody paying off a mortgage. Over time, it's less and less of your income or proportion of your income is going on housing. So we need the same affordability. It has to reduce, that you're spending initially maybe 30% of your income, then it's 25%, 20%, 15% of your income, particularly as you get into old age, that you need, it needs to be a lesser proportion. We're hung up on rents that we talk about 1,500 or 2,000 a month or 2,500 a month. In other countries where they set up sustainable systems and say create that system where there's proper funding and revolving funding happening, the rents are 700, 800 euro a month. So we shouldn't be thinking, we should not be brought into that space. The other thing I'd say, it's not just about delivery. We need decent homes for people. It's not about putting in a box here for someone to live in. You need to think it's a person's home. Decent live, every household, they need decent living space in particular, and it has to be healthy and decent, and then linked into the rest of the community.
I noticed there, John, that you did mention the housing deficit that we're facing at the moment quite a lot. You were very careful not to call it a housing emergency. Mentioned that the government does need to recognise the housing deficit at the moment, and that was one of the findings of the Commission. What is your opinion on a housing emergency? Do you think one should be declared? Is that overstepping the mark? Would it be unhelpful to solving the issues that we have at the moment?
Well, just specifically on the housing deficit,
Yes.
the very first recommendation of the Housing Commission's report is we need to recognise the deficit. And we did say emergency action needs to be taken to deal with the deficit. So it's not about tweaking the planning system or tweaking this or that, which is for the long ongoing supply. Rather than calling the housing emergency, we said you need to take emergency action to deal with the housing deficit. So that everyone who needs a home has access to a home. So, focused in specifically emergency action to deal with the deficit. So rather than talking about an emergency in a broad way that might sometimes lose its meaning, is saying in this, it's not, you need to do something. Again, it was raised at the session that Ciaran Mullooly arranged today, is that you need kind of COVID type actions.
Yes.
It's and everybody needs to come together and cooperate, in relation to that type of action. The other thing I would say, because sometimes with the Housing Commission report, people pick bits and pieces of the Housing Commission report. For instance, we highlighted, serious issues in terms of infrastructure, which is a really serious issue in this country across provision of water, provision of electricity. We also, in addition to those, we talk about our planning system. The Housing Commission is saying, don't be blaming, people about traffic planning, applications and that. We need to engage the public further, earlier in relation to the planning process in terms of participating in the planning process. So currently we have this development plan process, which is not accessible to the general public. So while, when we're planning, our towns, cities and villages, rural areas, it needs to be presented to the public, in a visual way, and under,
people can understand.
People understand. So that you get that participation at the early stage. So rather than they things about you can have housing here, mixed developments, there is actually design. How will city or town look like? This is what I want to achieve. So it's not to be saying, oh, there's all these people objecting. It's about actually people need to be involved from the start. Throughout my career, um, I've had obviously a huge amount of involvement with different groups and different people, in many parts of housing, and I'm still involved in various areas. I hate the word consultation. It's one thing I've come
Yeah.
to actually hate. That might be a very strong statement. You need to involve. It's
There's a difference
the
from
difference.
consulting
Yeah,
and
yeah,
involving.
yeah, yeah. I hate the consulting because we'll consult with the public and then we decide.
Yes, yeah.
It's you have to involve the
Hmm.
public on some very specific um, developments. Regeneration developments. I mentioned just one, say Fatwa, one that was very heavily involved in redevelopment of Fatwa mansions, called Fatwa mansions, Herberton in Dublin. That um, the state and the local authority maybe were failing the community because we're consulting but not involving. So we had to, and rightly had to switch to actually involving the community, and we need it in terms of equipping the residents to actually get involved by saying, here's how you understand plans, here's how you even providing classes on drawing, and understanding plans and elevations and providing models. So give the residents, give the public the means by which they can be involved. There was one unusual part of that project. We had everything designed, everything finished to commence the project, and one of the architects, in the project, said that the, the design of the development and community facilities, wasn't didn't necessarily create a good community inclusive area. He asked, could he could the whole plan be changed? I was at the time I was horrified, and I said you can do that if you can convince the residents. Very surprising to me. Very genuine person, and he sat down with you know maybe 100 or so, residents, whoever wanted to participate, and they agreed a whole change in the plan. But it was because he had that attitude of actually let's sit down with the community and let the community, decide and work through what worked best for them, and it's very in terms of very successful from that perspective, and it's really building a strong community. The other thing actually that I found in other aspects is the sometimes when something happens, or there's a big change, it gets the community involved, and actually it builds a lot of integration. People get to know one another, they're talking to one another because they have a common cause, and it can be really so sometimes out of a controversial situation can actually galvanize a community and actually build a very strong community for the long term. Anyway, the involvement. We also, so in that case, the staff, some of the staff working from Dublin City Council for the redevelopment, their office was based in the middle of the development, so anybody in the community could come in and talk to them, and and regular meetings. So it's actually, yeah. So anyway, the one piece one piece of advice for my career is it's an involvement, engagement, not as a
It's not consulting, it's not dictating.
dictating, because there is from the public sector side, from the government, side, we tend to too much dictate. The other thing I found actually, we assume, when I say we, I've been in the public sector for many years, and so the workings of the public sector, various arms of the public sector, various arms of the government, we often think we decide what people want. Okay, and I've always been actually surprised, because I have my own prejudices or biases.
Yes.
When you actually consult, I shouldn't say, or involve people and ask them what do they want, it's actually quite different from what we say in the public sector,
Yes.
think people want. And actually, the other thing, the consistency of what people want. So on the housing area in terms of like affordable, getting access to affordable housing. People, when you consult and engage, involve people, they want they don't want necessarily handouts. They want support, you know, to be able to access housing.
Hmm.
Uh, they, in some cases, often want some, funding in order to get them on their way. They're happy
Yes.
to actually later pay back that funding, when they can, but they want assistance and support. They don't want to be saying to their friends, by the way, I got this special grant that nobody else got.
Hmm.
They want to be able to say, actually, I maybe got provision from a vacant homes grant or something, that I'm not, that's available to everyone,
Yes.
not just to me because of my circumstances.
Hmm.
And they want choice, that the what I found, people, don't like to look at that's your house, or that's what you're getting. They want an element of, they want to pick,
A choice.
a choice. So it's surprising. I won't go into other ones, um, but one very large area where there's thousands of homes, which is in part of North County Dublin, and other areas there, which had stalled after the financial crisis, and there were architects and planners involved, thinking, what the residents wanted. Did they want the hoardings painted? Did they want, around the unfinished sites done? And they set out. So be it others outside the community deciding what they thought the community needed,
Hmm.
and what the community wanted was actually quite different. One, there's a new train station, Dart station, beside the development, and there was a road which is about 200, 300 meters long, that wasn't finished. So a lot of residents had to walk a mile to the train station. So they said, this, we want to be able to get to the train station. We don't, so could you please finish off this 300 meters of road,
Hmm.
so we can access the train station. They said they also bought into this, development, or moved into this development, because there was to be a pathway to the coast, where they could walk from the development to the sea, which unfortunately isn't, even to this day, isn't in place. I said, look at that. That's what we think is really important. Would you please finish this path so we can walk to the sea? The report ended up being called a pathway to the coast. They also actually, and this is pre working at home, post COVID and working from home, it turned out that in the development, 50% pre COVID,
Hmm.
what we're talking about more, 50% of the residents actually worked from home. Vacant retail units that are closed up, why can't they be opened? So that we can mix during the day, or we have a room to meet, who our client, or who we're working for, and share spaces. Why cannot that be done? So anyway, it was a revelation to me, anyway, in terms of again, what people want as opposed to what we think people want. It's, really, really important. And to give, we all have different levels of skills, in terms of our knowledge. So we need to equip people, with the necessary skills, and to communicate, appropriately. We're poor at, we can be poor at communication. Just on a personal level, as a child, teenager, I struggled reading. It's a very severe dyslexia. You just realize, in terms of trying to communicate, and you know inclusive. Sometimes the system doesn't allow you to actually properly engage,
Yes.
include.
Plenty of aspects there of the Housing Commission report. I think we've gone over most of the findings. Definitely a lot for the
Yeah.
government to consider, a lot for the wider stakeholders and the building industry, the housing sector as a whole. Thank you very much for your time.
If I could just say one last thing, to apologize.
Yes,
Just
of
one
course,
last
of course.
thing. And just picking out the some of the recommendations. There's one, particularly important and specific. We talk about homelessness, and the Commission specifically made a recommendation in relation to dealing with child homelessness. That child homelessness, is unacceptable. We specifically said that we have to address child homelessness and end child homelessness in the country. So that's one specific recommendation. Just want to call it out.
That needs to be ended.
Yes.
There's very few more important than that, I'm sure.
No, it's really important. The development stage, early development of a child's life is so critical.
Ending with his thoughts on how the Housing Commission sought to address what is perhaps the most pressing issue when it comes to Ireland's housing crisis, child homelessness, my sincere thanks to John O'Connor for this wide-ranging and insightful look into the work of the Housing Commission and how the recommendations laid out in its report must be put into action. Thank you very much for listening to this week's episode of Mullooly Matters, and make sure to join us again next week, where we will gather more insights from Ciaran Mullooly's housing event in Galway, brought to you in association with Renew Europe. Be sure to never miss an episode of Mullooly Matters by hitting subscribe to our podcast. Until next time, goodbye.